Welcome to another episode of the 4MS podcast. This week I had the pleasure of chatting with Keith Fullerton Whitman about his background and his creative process. To say that I learned a lot from listening to him is more than an understatement. Keith was an early adopter of 4MS modules right from the onset of the company, and he's been a Eurorack user since the late 90s, so the amount of information this guy has ingested is absolutely insane. I hope that this episode brings you the same amount of curiosity and inspiration that I got from chatting with him. And yeah, let's dive right in. Did you come from a musical background? Did you come from a science background? Where did it all start for you?
I'm the child of two programmers that worked in the Ma Bell system here in New York. Like, they were both working at the 1166 Avenue of the Americas, you know, the main AT&T hub. And my dad was like a director of billing, so he was like a big data guy. And my mom was a systems analyst, you know, like basically a COBOL programmer. This was, you know, in the 70s. So to say that coming from music from a technical perspective, you know, is definitely 100% how I, you know, because I grew up, the first music I ever made was with computers, you know, 286s basically, right? Commodore 64, Atari ST, that kind of stuff. So definitely, like, before I could play an instrument, like before I got good at guitar or whatever, it was all computers, you know. It was all writing, you know, basic code to make sounds, peek and poke, Commodore stuff, you know. So maybe that's a bit unusual, I think. You know, even before I was even like, oh, I should learn how to play drums, or oh, I want to play this guitar solo. It was like, how can I make the melody of Herbie Hancock's Rocket on my Commodore 64, you know?
So when you were getting started with all that stuff, were you approaching it from a kind of sound design exploratory perspective, or were you actually interested in making music out of the gate?
Yeah. It was definitely like, I mean, probably video game music and these things were the first thought where I was like, oh, you could actually have, like, one person can call all the shots and orchestrate and, you know, design the instruments or just come up with novel combinations. So I definitely, like, I first started thinking of it more along a production capacity than a performance capacity, right? But yeah, I mean, it's funny how, like, I started with that mindset and then I had to kind of like work backwards. And then, you know, when I was a teenager, I would play in bands and play guitar and do all that stuff, play synths and keyboards. But always with the end result in mind, you know, kind of maybe I have more of like the, you know, the structural thought process has always been embedded in there since day one. So yeah, but definitely, like, and then as I grew through music and just, you know, all of my experience in music was all through records and, you know, some going to see concerts when I was a bit older, but growing up definitely was like hearing music. And it was instantly, I was encouraged to go as deep and as far as I could into music, you know, just getting to jazz, but then instantly going to the periphery of jazz, getting into classical music and then going to the periphery of that. So yeah, I kind of didn't rule anything out for a long time.
And when you were younger, were you like a fan of electronic music?
I was, because I'm trying to think of the first thing. I mean, other than, yeah, like Herbie Hancock would have been like a crucial thing for me. But, you know, I grew up in the 80s and like the halo of New York City. And it was just the radio was rap music, electro, freestyle. It was like all that was very active, you know. And we would get all the terrestrial stations, you know, from the city, you know, in Bergen County where I was living at the time. So yeah, it was just like this incredible. I mean, think about that time. So if I was 10 years old in 83, so 83 to 93, like just think of all of that New York centric, different movements in music. They were all kind of happening simultaneously within 10 miles of totally different, like disparate backgrounds and cultural things. But all of it was like just this incredible cultural density all right around me. So
at that time in the 80s in Jersey, what was the scene like for, I guess, teenagers and younger kids? Mm-hmm. You're doing stuff on a Commodore 64. It sounds to me like at the time there's probably like a more guitar-centric focus, I would imagine, especially in Jersey.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean,
did you find other weirdos? Like, how did you?
I mean, in time, yeah. Like anything, these things take time, you know. I played in like, you know, like a classic rock covers band, you know, when I was probably 14 or 15, and that was playing guitar. But as far as electronic music things, I mean, I have the faintest memory of this, and I wish I could go into more detail about it. But for 1 year, I joined like an electronic music club. It was when I was 17 or 18, like a junior in high school. And it was in a guy's house. I was the only person below 40. And I brought like I had a synth called a Multivox, which was like a, you know, it's like a preset slider synth with 2 octaves, you know. Like it's like one of those Italian like mono synths that has all the popcorn preset and the frog preset, like one of those. But it was like the rest of the people in the club were all older. You know, they would bring modulars or they would bring something fancy like a Parker Steiner Synthicon or something like that, you know. I didn't understand it. I was very enthusiastic. Like I wanted to make stuff that sounded like maybe Devo or whatever, Perubu, you know, like this kind of thing. They were all very skilled, and I think they had like an unusual amount of patience for me. But then at the end of the class, there was like a quiz / like a final, and I failed it miserably because it was probably like, how does subtractive synthesis work? What does an ADSR stand for? That kind of thing. And I wasn't like, even though I was coming up computationally thinking about music in this way, I just wasn't like in the lingo of electronic music in that way. I was thinking more of this kind of fantasy, magical thinking thing about electronic music. And maybe part of why I'm still so into this stuff is that I never really shed that. Like, I'm still thinking like, this is a thing that technically is possible, so let's see if it's possible. Much of the work I do here in New York City these days is like with visual artists who also are very like unlimited by their ways of thinking. Let's see if you, Keith, can technically realize this thing that we're envisioning that might be impossible, but if it's going to be possible, someone like you will figure it out. So I've become very useful to a group of people in this way, just making max patches and also, building synthesizer things or whatever mostly for visual artists. So, yeah.
So talking about Max, when did you first get into Max? Because I know, like, at least, earlier in your career, you were kind of exclusively using Max, right?
I was, yeah. I was not like a year zero Max person, but definitely like opcode era for sure. Yeah, I got to Berkeley in 91 in Boston. So that would have been Max 3 then, right? So that's already, we're talking 35 years ago. Geez, I've been using Max for 35 years. That is crazy.
And that's before MSP, right?
It was way before you could do anything with audio. It was just, the serial bus things were happening then. I remember the Goldbrick interface, and there was like this, like a Michel Weisvis type like power glove thing you could have play your Max Patches controllers with. But definitely no audio. It was just running MIDI, basically, synthesizers, pre-OSC, pre all of that stuff. So it was just what you could do with the serial bus in the software itself. So
yeah, I remember when I was talking to Richard Devine, he was talking about how Max MSP just blew his mind because it was the first time he could basically send so much MIDI data to a drum machine that it would crash.
Right, exactly. Yeah. This was the lure for me. I was probably using something like Mastertrax Pro or Studio Vision, and then, the PPQ rates, every generation of those packages was getting a little bit better and a little bit more fine-grained, and then finally got to the point where you could actually like blow up an Akai sampler, not physically blow it up, but you could overload the MIDI bus to the point where it would start spitting out this granular audio rate stuff, and I would find that really appealing. So
your early Max experiments, was there like a particular kind of dragon you were chasing or a thing you were trying to do? Like what was that era like?
Just things with like teaching computers to be loose and to make free time kind of music, and just anything that was like against rigidity I was very interested in back then. And still to this day, Yeah, it just was like, kind of like grid things were interesting to some extent. I kind of came back to those things maybe like 10 years ago, more rigidity timing wise. But early on, it was definitely like, let's have these numbers take a drunk walk through the here and to see where if it would lead to some place where it really stopped sounding like computer music as you knew it. It was more this aesthetic kind of free blob, like lots of asynchronous things all happening at once that were doing like rubato kind of phrasing. So I stuck to that for a long time with Max. It was kind of my bag, so to speak,
And at that time, when you were first engaging with Max, were you also experimenting with like electroacoustic stuff at the same time, or was it exclusively tech?
No, I mean, it was like I as a form, I knew it from records. Again, like I had heard, the Pierre Henry, Francois Bale, stuff like that. It's funny. I was pricing records today, and I came through this whole stack. This is from my friend's collection, and it's all of the records. It's all of the actual records that I would have heard when I was a kid. All these like Mercury Limelight records, like Song of the Second Moon and all the Pierre Henry and all the, Francois Bale, Luc Ferrari and all that stuff.
All the weird tape music.
Well, just like because they were available, there were budget records that you could find in every record store. Like Sears sold them, in the 70s and 80s, or Woolworths,
Really? Wow.
Yeah, it was like Must Like None Such. It was a budget label, so the records were very cheap and, like these beautiful Milton Glaser-esque covers, they're really nice. So yeah, definitely like going through records as a kid, holding these, being like, ooh, electronic panorama, what's this? And it was all, that stuff. So I was lucky early on. I kind of got tuned into that thing, of just like free aesthetic electronic music, way before I got into techno or electronic and that stuff. So again, I kind of went backwards, like, like I started with the difficult stuff and then like reduced it to like Miami bass and was like, whoa, this is also really great and powerful. Like how cool,
When did your language of of synthesis proper start to develop? Because it sounds like you're working with MIDI and...
Yeah, it's kind of like the story where, the kid that doesn't want to take piano lessons and then it kind of throws them off the trail for a while. It was the same thing with me in electronic music. With synthesizers specifically, it was like I had this kind of negative experience with this club and I was like, man, I'll never get any of this stuff. But also I was, 16, And then when I got to Berkeley, it was like pretty much just computer things, I got very deep into, like sampling and sequencing and all that stuff, like digital era stuff. And then it was only like maybe in the later in the 90s when I started going to Europe more and then like started to see that resurgence of Eurorack and Dope and all those things were happening like in the late 90s. It definitely got interesting to me. I started to see more people playing Euroracks like Dope systems. And I was like, this feels approachable to me. It feels way more like building it down or breaking it down to its building blocks. And could be a nice thing to have a complex digital system, but also have this really pure analog thing kind of happening simultaneously to have both qualities of sound, So, yeah, I started to put together, that kind of system probably around 98 or 99, wherever the first time I saw that stuff in a store was. So,
I guess you're doing a residency somewhere right now?
I did one, was that our last week? Geez, it was sort of last week. At the NYU Tandon School of Engineering, which is, this is a guy named Luc Dubois set up a whole... It's like an accessibility studio. Everything has braille or these like tactile legends to display what the controls are. So like a Surge synth will have an orange triangle for an input and it'll have like a hexagon for an output, that kind of thing. So somebody can actually use it fully tactile, without actually knowing what any of it is. You can just feel it. He basically him and a team of people there invented this whole system, the novel system for doing that. So. And they've just started letting people come in and use it to, make music. And, it was very nice to be in there. I'm a big Surge guy. Like I came up using the Paperface stuff at Harvard, that, Ivan Shrepnin was, Surge gave all the prototypes to that school. And they still have them, the Huziak at Harvard. So, yeah, I definitely cut my teeth thinking of music like patch chord music using that stuff. Yeah, I think of everything now in terms of the way that the Surge works. Like, you have to make loops. You have to make things that end and start that patch back into themselves to make continuity. Like that's still the way I see these things. Even though Euro doesn't really have anything. I mean, there's an equivalence to that, but it's not the way that Euro tends to work. Things that loop, you'll have a switch for looping,
I was actually curious because I saw a lot of Surge and I imagine that there was a lot of crossover there. And the thing about Surge that I kind of wanted to touch on is patch programmability concept of how every module is a single function that can go all the way down to CV rate and all the way up to audio rate. And everything is kind of interchangeable and stackable with bananas. So it seems very fitting for your kind of music. And I'm bringing that up because I'm kind of interested in hearing how you migrated from kind of understanding Surge and that kind of stuff and adopting Eurorack, which is a bit more, it's like a little less loose and nonlinear in a weird way. Like,
I understand.
So what was it about the Eurorack format that attracted you?
It was small. I mean, honestly, that first, like the Dope for suitcase, the wooden, like two rows, 6U, and then the physical size, my mini jack, and you could bring that on an airplane as a carry-on. The first one that I got, I'm sure I got in Berlin. There was a store, even before Schneider's and all that, there was a store that just sold Dope for, in somewhere in Mitte. And I was just like, yeah, this is like, I could get this on an airplane. Or it could go in the luggage, and I wouldn't be worrying about, hauling this gigantic, because like some of the bigger Buchla and Surge systems is like bringing a car with you, it's massive, and also they were very cheap. They're still to this day, Dope for stuff is very cheap, It's definitely like he took the Moog lessons of like affordability to heart, I think, to some extent, and then those things, I mean, they're great building blocks in that whole line to start with, I probably bought an empty case and an oscillator one year. And then the next year I went back and I got a filter and AVCA, it was like, and just doing it that way, but really thinking about, which of the 8 filters I was going to come home with, that sort of thing. And then it took me a few years before I even had like a voice, it was really just like, how much can I get away with patching this oscillator back into itself and, that kind of thing. Yeah. So really that like delayed gratification side of it really helps you maximize all the potential of like a single module, a single circuit. And I still kind of force myself to do that. I'm not a big like hoarder of stuff, although I have kind of a backlog going here now. But I'm a big fan of like really sitting with one module and just kind of getting everything mapped out just in my own mind, not even necessarily manual wise, just this, it's possible for this thing to do that, you know? And obviously this becomes more complicated when you get into embedded computer, you know, like modules that are, you know, small computers that can kind of do everything, like a ornament and crime or whatever, you know, like that. I love that stuff so much, especially right now. I'm rocking a very fully digital system, and the mission creep is pretty incredible where, you know, I'll sit down and be like, oh, I forgot this is also a precision adder. Oh, of course, this is also a quantizer. Yes, I don't need those things as well. They're just alternate modes of this. So
with the way things are going, you know, like we have the meta module now, which is effectively an entire...
Yeah, which is, I mean, again, I mean, not to toot your horn, but a fascinating, just like snake eats its own tail Ouroboros of a module, like incredible idea. I've yet to fully justify it, although I'm close. I'm close to thinking like this would solve a problem, a specific problem, you know? I haven't gotten to that problem yet, but it's like right around the corner, you know?
I quote him often, but in the words of Walker from Make Noise, which is something he said about one of their products, I think it creates more problems than solves them.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is for certain a gigantic problem. Yeah.
So speaking of Make Noise, I actually, I'm late to the party. I'm a bit younger than you, but I first heard about you when you did the 7-inch with them the Make Noise shared system. Yeah. And I was like very green at the time and really excited about synthesizers. And I remember hearing your 7-inch and I was just like, what? Like what? People can do that with synthesizers?
You know what's funny? I sent them like 4 or 5 things. One was like voice going through the Phonogene. One was guitar through some of the Echoline things. And Tony, I think it was Tony, head executive, he was just like, nothing that's any sound that's not what the synthesizer makes. And I remember being like really let down by that because I was like, why make this like tape concept and then not allow concrete sound? You know, for me, it was such a weird, like, I understand why. It was like, it was to showcase the synthesis capabilities of it, right? But I listened back to the other pieces I did that were on the single the other day, and I was like, these are really great. Like they, to me, sound way more contemporary or interesting than just, you know, the you know, year zero Make Noise, you know, the DPO, like that, which is great. You know, like he did such an incredible job with that stuff. And really, Tony was like maybe one of the first out of the gate in that the second wave after Dopefer, you know? I definitely was like one of the first non-Dopefer modules I got. It was like Banana Log, maybe some of Peter Grenadier stuff, like the Plan B stuff. And then, yeah, Make Noise, yeah.
I think I saw an old... I remember, like, because that was around the time I was getting into all this, like 2012. I remember seeing, didn't you have a lot of Harvest Men at one point? Like, I remember seeing a lot of Orange Knobs.
Totally, yeah. Scott's a genius. Yeah, really incredible. Yeah, early on, I was very smitten with Scott's whole ethos, like Harvest Men era, pre-IME, whatever he's on now. But, yeah, really. I mean, also, again, tickles this, like, early, like, low bit, low sample rate thing that I just love so much about, you know, that kind of... you know, 12-bit Akai samplers, but also just like grungy, you know, like just single delay chip kind of, you know, delay pedals. That stuff I really love. And Scott was such an incredible, like, because his influences were like, yeah, Russian black metal and then like Eastern European, like minimal synth music, like Latvian, you know, like cold wave. And it was like such a neat, like, okay, he's got such this really narrow frame of reference, and I love that stuff so much. So it was like when I finally met him, like we went to Japan one year to do a synth conference, and I got to like sit down and pick his brain, and he was like this incredibly fascinating guy, you know.
Scott is one of the coolest and nicest human beings I ever met.
Yeah, really. And like he's not in the public eye in this way.
No.
Like, he doesn't do stuff like this really. So that's cool that you kind of nabbed him, you know.
There was a time I was sitting on a couch with him at Modular 8 here when it was still open, and I asked him at the time I was working on. He does all, like, obviously, like, fixed math, 8-bit, crazy stuff. And I was asking him about wavetable interpolation, and he just, like, on the back of a napkin, just, like, wrote out
the formula, the Nyquist intervention, yeah, like the whole, yeah.
and handed it to me. And I have it framed in my shop.
Yeah, he's a napkin at a restaurant, at a bar kind of dude. Like, he'll just be like, this is the math. Like, this, you know, this is how you do it.
He's also really... really funny, not surprisingly either.
I had the most fun in that era where I was rocking a lot of Scott stuff early on. I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. The Time Safari 1 with the Sound of Thunder breakout and all that stuff was just Like Mark Fell and I did a tour one year. This is like 2013, 2014 as a duo. We played, probably a dozen shows over a year. And it was just Mark running his Maximus P patch, controlling my Euro stuff. And I was, mixing it and dubbing it in real time. But all the structure came from Mark, which was great. And it was like the Mungo stuff, the guy John Pillin in Australia. It was Scott's stuff. It was all the low-bit kind of digital computer music stuff in Eurorack, and that was what we decided was going to be our sound, our kind of lingua franca. And I still, I think in a very nostalgic way about that. That's probably like the second real wave of Euro when everything started to embrace the digitality of, like those chips, the clocking chips, it was really cool.
Pick controllers and all that.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of pick stuff, totally. Yeah. It was like the first wave of that.
So that being said, 8-bit, Atmel, that whole era, this was right around the time that Dan here at 4MS was starting up too. I remember also around that time seeing stuff like the RCD and the SEM in your rig. When did you first hear about 4MS and how did you...
I was going to Analog Haven, in LA and getting a lot of stuff from Sean. And it was like, again, it was like you guys were very early on as well. So it was kind of like when this idea of a experimental clock system came out, it was, the RCD, the SCM, the breakouts, all of that first wave. I feel like there was a St. Louis component of 4MS,
yes.
Right? Like at one point. So I went one year I played in St. Louis and some of our mutual friends took me to the space. And when you guys were still making like the tri-wave Pico generator and the noise swash and all that stuff.
So it was probably like when they were in kind of like almost like an anarchist squat.
Yeah, it was that. Yeah, when it was very alluring, it was extremely cool. And maybe I met Dan or Ralph or, like that era of people. I didn't buy anything because I was trying to conceptualize what it was I wanted to do, but it was definitely at a time where like a lot of the companies that now make Eurorack modules were making these standalone drone or noise boxes, and the 4MS ones were like incredibly, they were really great. They were inscrutable, like you couldn't, even with proper documentation, you weren't quite sure exactly what was happening chip to chip, Yeah, it was some Hex Schmidt trigger type stuff, whatever. It was like I sort of had an idea of how it worked, but I didn't know the nuts and bolts, And there was a lot of subterfuge where everybody was like, they'd wrap the core circuit in like some kind of Vactrol type box to stop people from understanding how it worked. It was like wrapped in plastic or rubber or something. You had to pick it apart. Yeah, so that was pretty cool. But it wasn't like, I think that was Eurorack was like a glimmer in their eye at that point, or they had just started maybe making the first ones, but. It didn't take very long for me to put together that it was the same people,
So was that a new way of thinking? Like, had you already started to kind of conceive of clocks in that kind of malleable way?
Yeah. I mean, that was, like I was saying earlier, like this idea of playing fast and loose with rigid time, like things that might be happening simultaneously that are unrelated, but then you could kind of have them influence each other, Like the way that Rob Herdijk made like an entire career out of this thing of like clocks and systems influencing each other, and a simple like CV feedback loop, at its core, could create this whole ethos for how synths could work. I mean, his whole thing is as valid as Don Buchler's, I think. It's very, it's a unique take on what music made on his instrument should sort of formally sound like. And I always love that kind of system where it's like, yeah, you can make volt per octave music on here, but it's at its core is designed for this thing that's, way closer to cybernetics than anything else,
Herdijk, especially with the Blippu box, like I always loved how he conceived of putting basically an entire patch in a box and making that the instrument.
Yeah, I mean, the Rungler circuit at its core is one of the best, and it's one of my favorite like paradigms in synthesis. It's just like at its core, you can have it lock. It'll occasionally just flip a switch, and then it'll be just perfectly, they'll be synced, but it's not like that's breaking it by doing that. You know what I mean? Like it's like a hack to make it do that. But at its core, it has to be chaotic and constantly whizzing around and starving and kind of coming back to life. And it's just really super fascinating, I finally sat down with one of his 5U systems. It was a year and a half ago at GRM. They have a whole, like the 5U system. And it was so great with the MIDI matrix and everything. Damn, what a great system. It's a shame we lost that guy way too early. He was just on the cusp of like another generation of that. But.
He was a genius, yeah. And there was that talk, I think, like 2 or 3 years ago, I think in Bristol, where, I don't know if you saw it, but it was this whole concept of using a ring mod like a delay reverb
Yeah, right.
thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I was just like, this guy is like thinking about things in the most fundamental
Yeah, but like getting
terms.
excited by an arcane application of a circuit like a ring modulator, but then like making that the root of something. Be like, this is something no one's done. Let's change our business model to embrace this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's because it's something we're all discovering for the first time now. Let's carry this through to its logical conclusion. You know, what a great way to run a company.
For real.
Yeah, it's really inspiring, you know. Yeah, he was not thinking of like the industry of commerce in any way. It was just how can we tickle people's fancy in this way, you know.
I know you do these very complex, chaotic, generative types of patching, and I guess what I'm curious about is when you're engaging with systems or individual modules, do you prefer single function modules like this is just a sample and hold, or do you prefer kind of more complicated full patch, kind of more Horde-like things? I mean, are you interested in like the complexity through simplicity type of approach?
I do love that. I love complexity through simplicity. I love a clock and an LFO running just slightly at a time with each other and all of the magic you get there. And you really do get fractal Lisa Zhu patterns. You get all of these quantifiable things that are kind of hard to replicate in a single function thing, right? I mean, you can do it with two function generators, again, just at a time. But the idea of just having two bases that are constantly at war with each other and then splintering out from there and, you know, attributing randomness to all the different, you know, ins and outs of things. For years, that was my thing. How complicated of a sound can I make out of two oscillators and two function generators, right? Now, I'm on like maybe my third full like romance to break up to vacation to romance to break up, you know, like thing with Eurorack, really. It's now, I'm, as of last year, very much like in it again, mindset-wise. And it's, the ornament crime stuff, the new whatever we're on now, the audio generation of, you know, the stuff that Nick is doing with Phaserville and all that, I think is really great. Again, this is how I'm hinting at something like the, you know, the meta module becoming a thought, because it's like I already went through the ER 301 years ago when I met Brian. I met Brian at that same thing in Tokyo that Scott and I were at. And I got a 301, and I absolutely just used nothing but that for about a year. And then this was right before the pandemic, and then I broke up with it because I was like, this is getting stupid. It's just I'm making computer music with a small, you know, with a module. I should just make computer music. And then I did. I went back to Max. I went back to, you know, using all that stuff and even like making C-Sound things again in Cecilia and using Bitwig and all that, which is great. Like I think that you have to have this push and pull of taking in new influence all the time, or else the thing that you do becomes so staid, you know, and stale. Honestly, I'm trying to avoid losing some kind of spark of discovery. You know, that's my day-to-day battle of like, what's the most inspiring thing? You know, I got one of those Oxy sequencers, the Oxy 1 Mark II. And it's just like, it's really kicking my ass right now, you know, in a way that I avoided sequencing my entire life. And now I'm like, why didn't I do this? This is such a great way of having, you know, 4 completely asynchronous things all going at once with different lengths, and they're all mutating, you know, and it's like, this is a system. Great. This is the kind of thing I would have built in Max, you know?
Yeah, we're at this really interesting point in tech where the worlds of computer music and synthesis and electroacoustic, these things that were kind of like separate compositional processes, have kind of it's like all of the quote unquote problems technologically have been solved.
But we will invent new problems for sure. I would hope for humanity that we would, especially within music, that we'd invent, like we'd regularly come up with new problems, you know, and we have, you know, like there's been new things this year, you know. I was thinking like Graham Wakefield's whole thing with the hardware versions of that gen stuff, like the K accumulator and all that. It's like, that's a new problem. Like pulsar synthesis and hardware is a new problem, right? Like we're getting there. And here we are. Like there's a thing you can just turn on, and it's semi-modular. It's pre-patched and, you know, it does that.
And I guess to be fair, like modular wasn't stereo or polyphonic a few years ago.
It's so stereo now. Everything in my whole system over there it has to be, you know, because I'm thinking like, I mean, I'm rarely doing multi-channel stuff with the modular. I kind of do all that in the computer, but I'm thinking of it like like a club PA that's very hard left and right. And I basically have multiples of everything going mono in each channel to make a stereo image that I can then like deviate, like have the whole clock just go out of phase on both channel, and what a sound that is, like, but how much forethought you have to put into getting that trick to happen. It has to be at the atomic root of everything you're doing. It has to be thinking, okay, there has to be a stereo image or two of these that are so close when they're in stereo, but a little bit out of phase, like a comb filter kind of sound. And then just to have them go fully, just, it's such a trick when it works beautifully,
When you're making a project, like, are you coming at it with an aesthetic preconceived notion of what you want to do, or does the tech inspire you?
It's a push and pull for sure. Yeah. I mean, I there's definitely like an ideal system in my mind where it's kind of mostly self-policing, like I'll set up a framework and there'll be some melodic or rhythmic structure to it. And then it has to be the path of least resistance using just like simple macro controls to have everything just shatter, in a repeatable way, but never the same twice. Like it has to be novel. It has to be every staging of a piece has to be new. But how I play it has to be like the thing that, like the me and the feedback loop part has to be the thing that lives or, like makes it live or die. It has to be such a crucial central part of it. Like, like I'm using randomness to influence clock divisions and things. I'm using 3 mini pegs right now. Right. So I have a thing where there's a simple macro control that's off, and then it's setting 6 random voltages out of like a Pamela's Pro that are clocked, and then that clock is kind of like that's doing that flex time thing where it's speeding up and slowing down, and that's controlling the division of the 3 pegs, but also the shape. So it's kind of like it'll be in the center, but then you'll start to really deviate, and all 3 of them will slightly go out of time with each other, and then it'll start getting into multiples and divisions in that way. Then you start to hear it kind of atomizing and moving around that way, right? So, but it's all from a single knob, right? It has to be a thing where I can have my hand on it, playing, my eyes closed, and then just like, okay, this is the smallest amount of randomness, 10%, 15%, 20%, and then you can hear it you have to present it as like a structured thing, and then here's how it breaks apart, which is this little bit of influence, right? So that's how I'm approaching this particular thing right now, because in mind, I want to hear free jazz. I want to hear, I want to hear all these limbs moving independently, but then they can come back together when it's time. But also I have a little bit of control as like the band leader of like when it happens, or how it happens. But
kind of like that lock pod on the Rungler. It's like very similar.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Length,
right. Yeah. You flip a switch and it's locked. Right. Exactly. And then you flip it again and then it starts to just fall apart. Right. So recreating that kind of thing at more of a smaller scale, but also having a bunch of them,
What's inspiring you lately, musically or even not? One of the things that I'm trying to do with these podcasts is kind of get more about like the actual artist's life, kind of like the world outside of the studio.
Yeah. Well, it's the summer now, so I've been traveling a little bit. I was playing concerts the last few weekends, but this week my son and I have off, so we've been doing fun stuff. He learned how to ride a bike today. That was really exciting. So he did his first real like laps around the basketball court by himself, and we're all really psyched on that. So without skinning his knee, without wiping out. So that was really great. But we kind of like we live in Brooklyn, right by Fort Greene Park, and it's just like there's endless things to do. There's endless outdoor music and festivals and fun stuff. It's like, so that's kind of our day-to-day life these days. But then, I try to go out. I go out like maybe 2 or 3 nights a week to concerts. That's mostly what I'm interested in, is this kind of ad hoc improvised music scenes here, which I love. There's so many places. There's different people running different series every week, so I can go like, if I have like a free week, so, Calder staying, with his mom or something, I'll just go to things constantly, and I never run out of like interesting people to hear or like scenes to check out, This place is pretty deep, It's deep, and people are holding on here in an incredible way. Like these things are all viable. So
yeah, what's going on in New York these days? I haven't really tapped into it in a hot minute.
Yeah, I go out. I mean, I was just on Monday. I was at a Basement, which is like a regular series at Artist Space. That's really great. They used to run it at Max Fish. It was like like 4 experimental music acts. There was like Mike Bernstein was doing his robot orchestra thing that he built, and it's all like Arduino controlled, like pipes and just guitar, like a plectrum thing on a guitar. It's really, really great. Super into that. And like Don Dietrich from Barbita Magos played with his daughter Camille, and that was excellent. It was like, cello, sax, just like amplifier blowout for an hour straight. So good. But yeah, there's just like, I kind of love all music. I don't really rule anything out these days. I go to a lot of hip hop stuff. I go to a lot of noise things, straight up like harsh noise, and I go to a lot of quiet stuff. I go to a lot of like, the new music and minimalism things, so I try to, it's like I try not to like be too Catholic about staying in one discipline or one scene, because you kind of don't have to be like that anymore, Coming up, it was like you really had to identify with a scene to get anything to happen for yourself, but I'm so mid-career now that I can really just like throw caution to the wind and just show up places. And like I'll probably have one friend at like a black metal show out in Queens somewhere. I'm like, oh hey, what's up? Wearing my rainbow T-shirt, the only person in the room that's not wearing black or whatever. But it's funny how like it's still not weird, because I'm a grown ass man. Like I don't I can be unrepentant about the scene politics.
Yeah, I don't think people really care about any of that anymore. And I think
that's what I'm saying. This is like a very new thing. I think it's just coming out of the pandemic. I feel like there's less of this like I wear my identity on my sleeve and I'm this thing all the time. People are kind of way more malleable.
I think people are also really attracted to dorks now. Like I think being a dork is like really
it finally happened. We've arrived.
It's like now it's really funny. It's like now like the worst thing you could possibly be is like a jock.
I do love it. I do love going to some very cerebral thing, and it's all of those people who are like on the spectrum, and everybody kind of interprets it in a very different way, and the discourse is always so wonderful, I love that so much, But yeah, it's I went out to this in March. I went out to that algorithmic art assembly in San Francisco. Do you know that scene?
I don't know about it, no.
It's a lot of people making bespoke computer music. I mean, who are the stars of that scene? It's probably William Fields, Kindom. This guy Nathan Ho, that was absolutely fantastic. It's very much like a live scripting kind of thing, getting into, Max type things, But it's all like post-Autechre music, basically. It's all this very algorithmic, kind of sound designy, but still XOX kind of sounds, And that was really great. And it was like being in a room with like 100 me's at the age of 21. It was like really funny to look back and be like, I love these guys because I was 100% them and I had no community,
Yeah, and not to mention now, like with the last few years of the internet, someone on a Monday can decide they're interested in computer music and on Friday basically have a PhD in it.
You'd hope that was the yield of YouTube or whatever, right? It's not always the case, though. People being flippant is definitely a 21st century problem with identity and with music. Yes, I don't really call that a problem as much. I mean, I wish there was more staying power in difficult areas of art before they got brought back to fashion and image and all of this, or sexuality or anything, just kind of things that are way more alluring than, like computational problems in music, It's interesting. It's an interesting time. I mean, all those are valid. Like whatever you want to do, whatever direction you're pulled in life, I mean, you should obviously listen to your heart and do what what you enjoy. It is nice when there are brief dalliances with like difficult music. Suddenly there'll be all these like interesting people will flood into those scenes briefly, because one person has decided they're valid, and then all these people kind of trickle down, and that's really nice. I love when it happens, but oftentimes they don't sustain in ways you want them to. So
you're working in like chaos and generative systems, and when do you decide to kind of say something is either finished or ready to be performed? Like what is do you have like an internal kind of litmus test?
Yeah,
like,
sure.
I should kind of...
It's whether I like what I'm listening to or not,
Yeah.
I mean, that's like to boil it down to humanity, it's like, I hate this. And then an hour later, I'm like, this is interesting. And then an hour of listening to that thing, I'm like, now I hate this, And occasionally you'll be like, okay, I listened to this yesterday, and this is kind of going somewhere interesting. How can we make more of that thing happen? How can we boil that down to just that core element, It's definitely like, I mean, it's gotten to the point now I have a 6U 104 HP Euro system, and now there's another row of just like a spectral filter bank and some other things, right? So I kind of like, I don't think I'm done cooking it until like every jack of everything that's there is kind of doing something, which is like, again, it's a mad scientist disease, of just like, it's possible to maybe like make this one thing be slightly more, like irregular by introducing more of this, and there's so much tapering and attenuating and inverting and, offsetting things. That's like always from my stock and trade. It's just like not letting a thing just do a full range oscillation, just doing these little tiny burps and like chirrups of things. Just every 30 seconds, something will just manically change, And, again, with all of these multifunction things like the ornament and crime, you really can just have a process that's running for like a minute and then suddenly decides to kick into gear. You can pause something and then just, there it is, Now it's doing this incredibly complex wavetable mutation thing that's driving something else in FM, right? And then it stops, like kind of on its own. You have to program in a way for it to just kind of be just policing itself, right? So that's kind of like when I sit back and I listen to a thing for 45 minutes without touching it, and I'm like, the level of what it's doing, I want to be able to repeat this, and then I really start documenting and saving presets on things that I can, and then also being careful to kind of preserve ranges of things that I like, But it's so funny that it's like it hinges into like a graphic notation, like a kind of a post-war Cardew kind of thing where I'm interested in how these sounds change through time, but I can't get too into the like this is the form I desire and then it has to be the same every time because that always breaks down. And I'm like, no, leave it. If a process is running unabated, let it do its thing, and then there can be times where I will get lost while playing, and I want to embrace that stuff so much, Because it is it's gotten to the point now where I'm just as much of an audience member for a lot of this stuff as the people that are sitting down in front of me. So,
do you have that symptom that happens where you're like, yeah, this is so good, and then 6 months later you're like, yeah, it's so good, and then 5 years go by and you're like, that one sucked.
I'm so indecisive when it comes to matters of taste. I did a few concerts using like mostly recordings of Euro and Surge and Buchla and field recordings run through all that GRM stuff. Now it's, they released it as Atelier, right? And then I just love that way of working of just like having it crunch, like crawl through ranges of little windows of granular and things like that, right? But like single instances. And I had this real romance phase where I recorded so much stuff with that. And then I didn't touch it for like a year. I went back to Iraq and was happily doing that stuff. And then I just started doing these quad concerts again with that system, running it through a Tascam and like spatializing while playing, which is really fun to do as well. And I just was like, I went back and listened to all the stuff from like when was that? Probably like mid 2025 that I was like, I love this and now I hate it, And then I listened to it with fresh ears this year and I'm like, this is so great. Why don't I do something with this, And I have to strike while the iron is hot before I change my minds again because I'm so incredibly flippant. Like now I'm thinking like I'll do like a CD, like a double CD of just like these long 45-minute evolving things because they're so nice to listen to. But my brain the chemistry will shift. I guarantee it within the next like week or two. And I'll turn on this stuff, It's like a bad medicine that I'm just like it stops being, that like efficacy stops and now my brain is just like, stop doing this, go somewhere else.
I have this weird theory. If I'm really, really excited about something and I think it's really good, that means a long time from now it's actually going to suck. And the thing where I'm like, I don't know about this. You then listen to that 5 years later and you're like, whoa, that one was really cool.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to keep using this analogy, but that's lust. It really is. It's like you just temporarily, you're like, you get overwhelmed by some strange feeling. You're like, whoa, this is significant, right? What will I think about this tomorrow? Will I come to my senses? Will I wake up and be like, that was a bad decision, Or the way that I felt yesterday, even though it was, your own body's chemistry revealing itself to you. It's like, will this be regrettable, Like putting a lot of stock in trade of this thing, will that be regrettable the next day? And like, I can never think of music like other people might enjoy this because at the end, I've been so couched in this, like the 20th century notion of not being an entertainer, of not being like, it's just, it has to be this aesthetic discipline,
Also, I find it hard to believe if you're doing a 45-minute drone piece that you're chasing a mass audience. Yeah.
But it's not, I don't really make drone music anymore. I make these things that are so, they're rhythmic, they're skittering around at very fast rates, you get that gray area where there's like so much information that your brain just stops really calculating the individual transients, and you start to hear it as like that's like that Stockhausen thing of slowing down the fifth, and it's a polyrhythm 3/4, right? There's all that gray area and how your brain can interpret rhythm and sound, right? So I do love those, like right on the edges of those distinctions. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there, and playing around more with tuning these days. I'm doing a lot of tuning things while trying to avoid the obviously the cliche 2026 microtonal thing, which is terrible for the most part. Although the people that have been doing it for a while are great, don't get me wrong. I'm just worried about this new rock thing where I've already seen that guitar that what's that Canadian Behringer guitar company that makes all of like the clones, and now they make like a microtonal guitar, you know, and I'm like, oh God, this is going to get so like.
Well, it's interesting to see
bad.
how people are taking all the microtonal stuff and making like pop tunes.
And that's
with
fine.
it. Yeah.
I mean, it's fine in that it's like if that's a gateway into the discourse of this, which again is 100 years old and like
Sure.
fascinating, you know, like everything from Harry Partch. I mean, like all of
Sure.
that is like it's so good. It's such an interesting thing, you know. I just read that San Diego book, you know, the history of music in San Diego. The strange alien territory. It's great,
I don't know that one. I
but
read, what was it, Genesis of a Music? Is that Harry Partch's?
well, that's the classic
Yeah.
Harry Partch. That's from like 1949 too, which is crazy, right? So that's isn't that amazing that's such a formative text? You know, it's like Zanaka's formalized music. Like it'll get cited a lot, but it's a very difficult read until you're ready to ascribe to all of the math and the musicology of it. So
It seems to me, maybe you could speak more at length about it, but my understanding of it is like the tones and like everything that was done was based on ratios and just intonation. So it's like the reason why tunings that we have exist for certain instruments is because they create the overtones that we want that are pleasing to the ear. Yeah. And I guess that whole practice was kind of throwing out almost the aesthetics of the resonances and was all about the ratios of the math.
Yeah. Well, equal temperament kind of had to happen for instrument building, right? In the 17th century, right? It had to be, you know, like chords had to be scalable. Like you had to be able to play the same consonants as from, you know, as music modulated, right? So it's very hard to do that with just intonation. It has to be always like a root, and the harmonic series derives from the root, right?
So do you think about, like you said, you're working with microtonal stuff now?
Like, just intonation is a harmonic series thing. Like that to me is like I haven't really explored it in this way until I got the the chaos quantizer like a week or two ago, and now I'm like very much thinking about it, doing those generators type things with just doing it all in the harmonic series with just intonation. It sounds really, and the fact that you can kind of morph between equal, Pythagorean, just like, you know what I mean? It's like a cognitive dissonance thing when the music is going and then suddenly you hear it shift but then lock into some other, like that's only really been possible now with this thing. So that's a cool thing. Like morphing quantizers is that's like that's a problem that didn't exist, and now we can solve it because we have the thing to do it. So
it's interesting too, exploring those things. It's still at the voltage level in a certain sense because it doesn't become acoustic until it's reproduced by a speaker.
Exactly.
So
right.
It's pretty interesting exploring these things that were kind of from the acoustic universe of instrument design in electronics. Mm-hmm. Do you think about real world physics of acoustics a lot when
Absolutely.
you're working?
Yeah, no. I studied acoustics first year I was at Berkeley. I had a great teacher, Tom Pleshek, and he really put my head on, put the Helmholtz in my hand, was like, read this, it'll make sense to you. Now, like, here's the background, you know, for like the exploitation of like acoustic concepts in experimental music, you know, going from the New York School to the Alvin Lucier to whoever, you know, like there was all this great work that was being done, like the hedging of science and music, I think thing was really interesting, especially in the 60s and 70s, you know. And that bridging of acoustics, and now people are so acoustics forward, I think, with electronic music. As you play it in a club space or something like that, you can really get so fine grained with, how sound is spatialized. And, I think performers have maybe more control over this stuff than they ever did. I'm not even talking about like waveguides and wave field synthesis and the Meyer constellation and all these different things that are like, new methods for spatialization. But it's, like a DJ will have a preferred PA system, like that to me is such an interesting, like I only want to play in an L acoustic system or a Meyer or whatever. It's like that's, that pride in the totality of like staging an event, I think is so interesting and somewhat new, That's an aside, but you know what I mean? It's like that's that way of thinking, like I prefer to go to this space because of this way of thinking about sound and the choices they've made to realize that's cool as hell to me. So
do you like compose for spaces?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, with this stuff, with the Tellier stuff for sure, yeah. It's very like, I did one, was that last weekend? 2 weekends ago in DC, and it was in like a recording studio with a quad system, but then I also had a channel go into a guitar amp, and then I also was using the speakers in the laptop. So I had like a aggregate device of a Tascam that I could play, and then the quad sounded great, and then something went wrong, and I just had the 2 laptop speakers, so I kind of just like played the last 10 minutes of just in this it was like a small space. It was like 100 people. So then the thing that usually would be really loud was just the two laptop speakers going like, like almost like a square wave going between them at audio rates. And it was just the feeling of like sitting in front of the computer was so cool. And the people that were sitting right in front of me were like, that was really interesting. It sounded like your computer was levitating or something. I was like, right, because it was just doing this phase cancellation thing at audio rates. And it was really nice. And it was a total happy accident, So now I'm thinking, how can I repeat that, right? It felt intentional. It didn't feel like a weird failing. It felt like that was what I meant to do all along, Suddenly you can tell the quality of the sound was so loud, but coming out of the laptop speakers was such a nice, just the absolutely buckling or the trying to reproduce the bass of this like surge sound, so cool. And I can tell I'm like really excited about it now because I would have never thought of doing that way, like ending the big sound super quiet,
So you mentioned before, I had no idea that you were working with visual artists. Do you want to elaborate more on that?
It's not so much, and it's a lot of stuff in progress that I probably shouldn't talk about. It's like NDA stuff. But I generally avail myself to people here. They're like, established, other mid-career artists to do things like Max patches. And, Max has always been this like great toolkit for any time-based art, So you can really do timeline things very easily with it. I've noticed maybe more so recently people have been doing Max for Live things with timelines because, again, that's more of a structured way of having things happen, that loop every hour or whatever. But my thing is like I'll build a synthesis thing in Max that's just running on a machine that's behind the wall somewhere and the speakers are out. But, they can turn it on every morning and it auto boots into this thing and, runs all day. And if I'm needed, then I come down and reboot it or whatever. But, a lot of that kind of stuff. A lot of just like artists come over and we just brainstorm what kind of thing they're chasing, and then I will just play them records and be like, hey, have you heard this kind of thing? Have you thought about this sort of tuning or, this kind of waveform, But it's all, it's like, because it's things that loop and repeat all day in a gallery, they're pretty rudimentary for the most part.
Do you ever do your own installation art or do you have experience doing installation
Not
art?
in a long time. I've done video installations. Back in the past, I had a good relationship in Boston with a few different places. Like I did a video thing at the List Center one year and, like things like that. And for a long time when I was doing those guitar, like the playthroughs things, I would have a video, like a stop time film that would play behind me. That was like 12 frames per second of still images. And I would do a lot of like, in the box, early jitter kind of processing, more recently like VSynth kind of things, And then I had a great duo-ship for a couple of years with this guy, Pierce, who was doing also Max VSynth, but more like op art, black and white. And that was like really excellent to have somebody treating the visual side of it as a performance that was as as complicated as the audio side. It was really like two of us on stage and, two different senses. But having, like, I sent him a clock and a reset, and he would just derive, the very op art, Annie Albers kind of thing, from just the Eurorack trigger signals and the main rising sawtooth that generated the notes of the generator's patch. So it was cool to have that, like, one-to-one analog of the same two control signals being applied into sound and then into visual all in real time, was really nice. So
do you make your own outside of Max or whatever? Do you make your own custom tools, like your own plugins or anything? Or
no, I was big into Pluggo back in the day, but to be honest, it's just I try to rely less on. This is a whole conversation about like welcoming collaboration, and I feel like. Some of my all-time favorite music especially comes from that like private universe outsider thing where it's just one person against the world doing everything. But they're rewriting the gospel. You know what I mean? They're coming up with, they're solving problems that were solved ages ago, and they're wasting their time in this stuff. You know what I mean? It's like that kind of drives me crazy sometimes. Yes, when it's like if there's a need for a particular thing that doesn't exist, I'll try to make it in Max, for example, but. I don't really like render out plugins these days. I briefly got, like maybe 2 years ago when Juice started happening, I tried to write some plugins with that and didn't get very far because I realized it was like, how much of this do I need to do? Or a cursory Google would reveal that someone else, there's a GitHub repository of this exact thing, like it already exists. Like, again, there doesn't need to be a new ring modulator. There doesn't need to be a new low pass filter. These problems have been solved, even just like rating like the spin FE1 like type algorithms that all have been ported into, you know, a million things, hardware and software. It's like that work has been done. It's all been mapped out, you know?
Yeah. We're at this interesting point now where, from a product development standpoint, at least over here in terms of, what we've been talking about and think about is very much that Hordike thing of like everybody, there's a million filters, there's a million of everything. How can we kind of take a concept and put it all together into one box, like the Rungler or the Pendulum or something like that? And I guess I'm curious, like, do you have, I don't know, like, did you ever wish that you had like an instrument that was kind of like a template of things that you use that could be condensed down to less knobs? Like in the way that you were saying, you have like one macro that's controlling, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. I very much romanticize this. I'm not going to say the single knob. I mean, it was that company recently that put out the button random synth, right? The Semaform or whatever that was. And I feel like a part of me is like vehemently opposed to just a thing that's a gigantic randomize all parameters synth, because that maybe feels like a cop out to me. It's just like you just smash the button 1,000 times until it makes a thing that you like. And what does that say about you? It's like, what's your desire to get granular with this stuff? And, you know, why aren't you like that? You know, to want to really get into the nuts and bolts. And this was a conversation I was having with my brother recently about like AI skipping, like allowing you to skip forward and like skip the really pleasurable learning, you know, jumps of getting into electronic music. And like, why would you want to miss out on any of that stuff? You know, why would you want to miss out on like knowing what you're talking about, but also like the little, you know what I mean? Like I just figured out how an arpeggiator works, and now you can have it go backwards and forwards and jump in octaves, and these things are all within the basic language of arpeggiators, right? Like, why would you want to like not know that stuff to yield a piece of music that something else has made decisions on your behalf for? To me, that seems such a weird. It's such a 21st century problem, because obviously there's always going to be this tendency to get an advantage, you know, like to skip ahead somehow, go to the front of the line, you know, like, oh, I know the owner, can you let me in first? You know, like that. There's always going to be that thing, right? But why within, I mean, especially within experimental music, it seems such a weird, you know, like it's a tendency that I'm starting to see it more and more. I'm not even talking about like the fake it till you make it thing, which is also a problem, but like you know what I mean? Like to present yourself as like a considered person who's like thought about all of this great minutia within music, and then to like just outsource it, you know?
Well, electronic music is interesting because, I mean, it's really all music, actually, now that I'm thinking about this, but it's a cumulative knowledge base.
True.
It's like you're building upon the previous foundation of the last thing, and then
like, is there even a barrier of entry at this point? With, I mean, you have a computer or even a phone. Like, you have a phone that can do like 99% of this stuff, and it's just sitting right there. It's 4 free apps on the App Store that will do all of this. Like, it'll walk you through it. You know, just go through the presets. They're all in there, and it shows you how everything works. This is the order of basic building blocks that create this thing, you know, like.
I think the biggest one for me is VCV Rack, because not only is it free.
Yeah, VCV Rack is so great. It's so great, and it's gotten so great, you know, and everybody's using it as a teaching tool, which is also like that embrace of it and the discourse of it is such an excellent use of that. It's like, it's no longer an emulation of a thing, you know, it's its own thing. And it's wonderful, and you can have it running on your iPad. You know, you can have it running on anything. You know, you can sit on the couch, or you can sit in the passenger seat in a car ride and just learn synthesis in about a week. You know, just by going through everything.
So I want to go back, and forgive me if you don't want to talk about it, because I know it's insanely cliche to talk about and harp on AI.
It's fine. Yeah.
But I'm curious how you feel about because from a development standpoint, like, I am not a particularly skilled DSP engineer, for instance, and I'm very interested in synthesis and synthesis theory and know a lot about that stuff, but there's big holes for me mathematically in certain things, and I use AI to help fill those holes, right? And I don't necessarily feel like it, like we were talking about the fast forwarding, right? Like, I feel like you can still learn on the way there, but I'm curious.
So you're talking about Claude and like vibe coding and this sort of thing to fill in the gaps of like, how do I do a wet dry? Oh, there's already that. You type it into Claude. It gives you a wet dry in your plugin, and there it is. Boom, you're done. You move on to the next problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah, or like, hey, Claude, give me a wavetable with interpolation or whatever, how do you feel about integrating AI in terms of these kinds of...
I do worry. I think about this, okay, as an aside, I think to a greater conversation of which there's a million approaches to this, but as an aside, I'm a bit wary of like the fast forwarding with plugins in particular, because think about a really nice floating point, emulation of an LA2A compressor, for example, right? Now, someone sat down and did that math, right? They did the math to make it sound like the hardware. And not even getting into the hardware modeling and all this stuff. They figured out the curves, right? And that's a trial and error process, right? And then, this year, somebody goes, okay, I run a plugin company now. We need an overdrive. We need a spring reverb. We need whatever, right? And then it just, in an afternoon, they query Claude and it gives them whatever the spin FE1 code versions of those, whatever the most low level, like not great sounding even, just like not fussy, just like completions of that thought process. Here's an incongruous spring sound, and it gives you the same one it serves everybody else, right? And then that person then pays an engineer to generate a really beautiful GUI that makes it look fancier than it is. But it is the same code that everyone else is using, with no embellishment, no personalization even, And then they put that into the world as a graphically appealing thing, but it's so basic and so redundant and not good, not good in the way that you want the graphics to suffer and you want the sound to be somehow special, right? Like that's such a 21st century, it's such a this year problem where I run into these people, they're like, oh, have you used these plugins? And I'm like, oh, what are they? And they show me these beautiful looking things with moving animated graphics. And I'm like, this sounds really bad. Like this is not a good sounding reverb, which is I think what you wanted, right? You wanted a lush modulated reverb, right? But that's, how do you differentiate other than by using your ears? How do you differentiate between what a great janky vibe coded plugin is when the market is now flooded with thousands of them from every corner of the world? Every kid graduating a computer science, music adjacent computer science course has their plugin line, and they're probably making a little bit of money off of it,
I would argue that I think a lot of those people that you were describing actually were more interested in the pretty graphic interface as an inspirational starting point.
You think as a like a deterrent
well, I think it's a thing where it's like there's this trend in music tech lately where people want to engage with either complicated synthesis or whatever in a more simplified kind of cartoonish interface, and that's exciting for them, and maybe they're not necessarily interested in audio quality. I think there's a lot of people engaging in electronic music now that aren't even necessarily fully understanding what's going on at a deeper level. It's a really weird time,
There's so much to know, and if you're a young person and you want to get a leg up, it's impossible to have a nuanced opinion or take on every single part of this. I mean, it takes people their entire lives. Like I'm approaching my mid-50s now, and I don't have a grasp on a lot of it, I've avoided huge swaths of this because I've chosen to focus on whatever the things that are tangential to my practice, right?
I guess what I'm saying is, like, when I first heard of your stuff and when I was first getting interested in it, it seemed to me like most of the people who are engaging in this community were kind of either from more academic backgrounds or like really, really interested in taking things apart and getting into nuts and bolts.
Right. Yeah, of course.
And I don't know if that's really the case anymore. Like, I feel like people that are getting into Eurorack now in 2026 or whatever are like getting one or two modules that they saw on the internet that they think are really cool. And
I see a lot of the same Eurorack system at gigs here, and that's not to discredit people. I think that people are chasing a sound that's a shared sound, in certain scenes, certainly in this kind of like industrial, like techno scene in New York that's really huge right now. They're using a lot of the same things because they agree that that's the collective sound. It's like a fingerprint, It's like hearing Dan Lopatin and hearing the Juno and being like, that's the sound I want, right? And then there's no shame in following that, I used to always have a problem with things that are like maybe that second wave of a thing that's cloning it so well, to the point where it's like a mania. It's like, yes, I want to sound like this thing that exists that's huge, it's popular, and then like I always wonder what's the lifespan of like the second version of that exact thing going to be, but it usually ends up being popular as well. So it's I don't understand that tendency in humanity personally to always want to like just be exactly another thing, but I mean, there are new shoegaze bands playing in the city here that are great, and they're definitely like they're getting way noisier and way more experimental, and you're taking the My Bloody Valentine slow dive thing and like turning it into something else, and that's great. I'm not talking about furthering an idea. I'm talking about hearing someone like Dan Patton and like reverse engineering what he does, like using exactly the same Omnisphere patch to make a similar piece of music, and then shopping that around like an original idea, like that's an odd. This is like adjacent to the AI thing, of course, but it's also like
there's this neurosis of like
neurosis is what I would classify it as. It's like I have done such a great job at reverse engineering, a Shake Shack burger, and now I'm going to become a chef and start my own place, and we're only going to sell the Shake Shack burger that's exactly the same. We get the meat from the same place. We use the same grill top. And you're like, that exists, and it's like, why would you dedicate your life to this?
A lot of like aesthetic and technical decisions also in electronic music have also been kind of by just happenstance, where it's like this person had this machine, so that's what they used.
Yeah.
And people are like, to do that, you need this machine, and it has to be like this. Like I've seen people be like lusting after Alesis 3630 compressors.
Or the Porta Studio 424. Like we all saw that coming. When we started seeing Instagram top-downs of people with their desktop with the cute cables going between the teenage engineering thing through a 424 to get that sound, you were like, okay. Like the first year, you were like, I'm glad we're back to this. I'm glad we're back to cassettes, because cassettes are incredible. And again, it's like greater than the sum of its parts. It does an alchemical thing with sound, converting it into magnetic particles on a tape. It's like such a great, it's a physical reaction in a time of pure digital everything, that of course there's going to be a trend to embrace that again. But yeah, it's just funny in that. And then it reaches a critical mass where all you're seeing is like 4 out of 5 of everything on the internet is that. And you're like, you just saw the other person also having that revelation, and you just decided to glom onto it. And how does that help the greater thing of you doing it,
So what do you do creatively to kind of fight this this wave? Like how do you kind of orient yourself in this world?
I chase muse like anybody else, don't get me wrong. And yeah, of course I always land in places that are, like traveled paths, Like listen, when I was a kid, a teenager hearing Terry Riley for the first time, and my first Max MSP patches were like trying to make a time lag accumulator. I think I even called the patch time lag accumulator, right? Was I trying to replace Terry Riley? Was I trying to get his bookings? No, of course not. Like he had stopped making that music at that point anyway. But I was like, it's great to pay lip service to a huge macro influence like that and have it be part of the discourse. I think that's really healthy. But it's also like, like I had to stop and be like, am I trying to recreate a thing because I think that it's the solution for me, or because it's a solution that's out there? And then it was quickly a year or two in, I had to be like, how can I personalize this? So I will spread it wide open. I'll create all these filtering reactive things that will like extend the idea and turn it into something else, But I did dwell on that idea of like it being accurate to the Terry vision of that for maybe too long. And then I finally met him and played a concert with him in 2005, and I broke this all down, like my voyage, and he was like, I don't care. And I remember thinking, like, he didn't say it in like a devastating way, but he was like, yes, I also love these ideas, obviously. It's like, here, why are we having this conversation, but I remember thinking he did it in the most like humbling way, where I was like, right, I'm glad we agree. Let's just deviate from this point. I'll go in this direction, you go in this direction, and then let's never speak of this again,
I feel like not caring is also part of the whole Terry Riley.
Oh yeah, no, he's a wonderful guy. He's such a wonderful guy, But like, it was really a nice moment where I was like so worried about how that was going to go down, and I was like, that's maybe the best case scenario, is that he was like damning me with faint praise. Yeah, I like what you do. It's different. I'm like, okay, thanks. Yeah, great. And then we played together in a trio. It was like Lawrence English and Terry and I, and then I remember thinking, like, it was nice. It was very pretty. Like, Terry was playing piano, and I was running it through Max or something. I forget. But and it was kind of like, from his perspective, he was like, why did that have to happen? Like, well, who are these young guys? Like, it was just some interchangeable, And it was like, cool. It's great to be in a fly on the wall for a few days and, like, have that, humbling experience.
Absolutely.
It was really, really wonderful.
So looking forward into the very near future of like your present life, like what are you currently very excited by? Like what are you
like
what
traveling
really
again and playing this stuff and doing a completely different thing from night to night and not thinking about records. God, I'm so out of the mindset of like documenting it and having it be in magazines. Like I don't, you know what I mean? Like I'm just so through the looking glass on that whole thing, and it's so liberating to not have a marketplace reality of what you're doing. You know what I mean? It's like nothing I do is in the marketplace at all, unless you count something like Bandcamp, which is, I don't even really think of it like a record. You know, it's not like a record label. It's like a, you know, audio diary for me at least. But I'm getting bookings to go because I'm doing enough now. I've probably done about 15 or 16 concerts this year, mostly of the Eurorack stuff. And it's like gaining momentum, and it's starting to happen more again at like regional festivals. Like I'm going to Sound and Gravity in Chicago in a few weeks, and then touring with that band Setting, playing like bigger places with them. So that'll be really nice to do it. Kind of like, it's one thing to like to beta test something in like the artist run initiative type clubs here in New York City and have it be very, you know, experimental and still working through the kinks, and then getting it to a stable point where I can then travel. I can fly in an airplane and go somewhere and do it, which I haven't really done a lot of that, you know, in the last few years. So I'm very excited about this, of like being in breathable space with people trying to communicate this thing. But also like seeing each acoustic condition of each venue as like a unique challenge to somehow integrate something new every night to it. So
yeah. Are you coming to the Pacific Northwest at all anytime soon? Or
no, I haven't been there. I haven't been to Portland in probably 20 years.
Oh man, you gotta.
I played at the Blackbird of the Hrvatsky era, like way back in the day, and I've never come back. Yeah, Seattle once, Portland once, and I've never come back.
There's a lot of all that stuff out here. There's a lot
Yeah.
of people who would love to see you, I'm sure.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
yeah. I know that like Pete Swanson's back out there, and Pete and I are really good friends. So I'm going to see him in Chicago. He's playing the night before, so
cool.
So yeah, at some point, of course. Yeah, no, I always loved Portland. It was like, you know, playing has been this weird stumbling block. Like I think when I was reaching kind of a critical mass, that was when we had Calder, and then I stopped kind of doing that stuff. Lots of like domestic touring, you know. I would only do like the European like fly-in stuff because it was just, you know, made sense to do it. But yeah, and like San Francisco and Chicago, and like that's like just those places, you know, like yeah, those are my markets. Those are my people, right? Yeah.
Well, you know, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but
this is great.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And
yeah, hopefully something in there was usable for you.
I think a lot of it, if not all of it, was usable.
I have to say, doing this, it's like 5:30 here, or 5:15. I almost always do this kind of thing first thing in the morning while drinking coffee, and I get really, you know, caffeinated, but I'm sitting here drinking coconut water.
Nice.
And it's like the lights are dim. This is such it's clearer. It's way more, you know, like I can think a little clearer without.
So this is chill vibe.
Yeah. Note to self.
That concludes our interview with Keith Fullerton Whitman. I don't know about you, but I found that entire conversation to be incredibly enlightening. I have a long list of things that I need to look up and research from different artists and synthesis techniques that I've never heard of, and I'm just so pleased that Keith took time out of his day to sit down and talk to me. So just so you guys know, coming up for 4MS, we're going to be going to Denver for the eMix event that is happening out there, and we are also coming out to KnobCon. So if you're going to be at either one of those events, please come by, stop by our table, talk to us. Thomas is going to be in Denver. I'm going to be in Schaumburg at KnobCon. And stick around for more interviews coming in the near future. I'm really happy that we got this podcast off the ground. And if there's certain guests that you want to see on the show, feel free to shoot us a message. Have a great day.